It's Deep Focus. I'm your host, Mitch Goldman. We are going back to Monday, September 20th, 2010. Melvin Gibbs, my guest, and at WKCR we were doing a festival about this venue, Soundscape. Really cool, interesting place in Hell's Kitchen, and happy memories of going there. And a certain kind of profile of the music and the musicians that tended to play there. If you didn't hear our previous episode on Sonny Schrock, you should absolutely go back and listen to that. Guest was Melvin Gibbs. And in addition to, so Melvin's the guest again on this episode. And in addition to having those two things in common, that both of these episodes are about Soundscape, and both of these feature Melvin Gibbs, fantastic musician, absolutely spectacular radio guest, as you'll hear. They have, we call WKCR the home of technical difficulties. You are about to hear why. I held back on posting this episode in the past because it's incomplete. I would record the show on CDs, and occasionally one of them just wouldn't record properly. And a lot of the time that had to do with issues in the studio at WKCR. And, you know, we kind of joke about it, and we try to deflect about it. You know, I mean, the place has suffered for a long time from lack of funds and a lack of support. And we just keep pushing ahead and doing the best job we can. So I've got most of this show. I don't have all of this show, and I'm missing the first part of this show, which is really a shame. Melvin is talking about two brilliant musicians, one of whom is still with us. That's Lee Rozie, and you'll hear Melvin talking about him later in the show. The other is Arthur Rhames, who, like Melvin, was from Brooklyn. I think he was a couple of years ahead of Melvin and kind of an inspiration. He was known as a guitar player. Actually, the first time I encountered him, he was playing tenor saxophone with Elvin Jones, and I thought he was an astonishing musician then, until I found out it was his third instrument, I believe, after maybe second instrument, but primarily first known as a guitarist, and really quite ripping one at that. Not just technical facility, which he had in abundance, but the guy just had a fervor to him, and a pretty brilliant pianist too. Really inspiring character. And when you hear people like Melvin, who knew him much better than I did, talk about him, you hear why. But unfortunately, it starts in the middle of our conversation. So, setting aside all apologies and explanations and excuses, I wish I had the rest of this. If you do, please get in touch and send it my way. But here is what we have. You're going to hear two approximately 1 hour episodes from this show. So we're missing the first part. We're picking up in the middle. Once again, it's September 20th, 2010. Guest is Melvin Gibbs, and the topic is the venue Soundscape, and two musicians known for playing there, Arthur Rhames and tenor saxophonist, soprano saxophonist, Lee Rozie. It's Deep Focus. Here we go.
The guitar down and you play it. But he actually did it a little different this time. He actually kind of played the guitar like it actually was a piano. He had a different kind of fingering thing with it. And then I guess at some point he decided he wanted to be a saxophone player, and he just kind of picked up the sax and started playing the daylight side of the sax and picked up piano and essentially whatever he decided he wanted to do. You know, he'd be gone for, 6 months or whatever, and then he'd come back and he'd be on such a high level with it. And he became kind of well known as a saxophone player, and I guess he hooked up with Rashid Ali somewhere along the line, and Rashid kind of mentored him and brought him to sort of a wider recognition. And I've been doing some stuff with Antoine Roney, and I didn't know that Antoine was one of his busking buddies. They used to play in the street together and stuff. And, a lot of guys were aware of Arthur in many different scenes, but we kind of knew him as the guy from the hood who just really kicked all kind of beep.
Yeah. I remember him. I didn't even know he played guitar. I remember him as a saxophone player. I remember seeing him play with Elvin Jones at the Vanguard, and he was somebody that everybody around the scene everybody who was serious about the music seemed to know about him.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed, in fact, mentioning that date in particular, it's one could only imagine that Coltrane cast a long shadow.
Yes. And he definitely was evoking. I guess he made a point of evoking what Train was doing, and he went to all of the people. He was hung out with Rashid and Elvin and all of that, and he was a really great saxophone player. But as I said, us in the hood, I kind of have a special place in my heart for his guitar playing, because his guitar playing was, that's what influenced all of us the most in terms of being able to do certain things on the instrument in a certain way. I mean, if Vernon was here, he would speak more on that. I mean, you can definitely. It's almost like the guys from the hood are kind of carrying on the tradition. Nobody's. I mean, we're all doing our own thing, but the tradition is that idea that if you can do it. It's almost like I think I can. I know I can. It's like. Arthur was the one who sat down and, he wanted to do the Train thing, and he did it. And he played with the guys, and he could bring that same spirit into the room, and on the piano, he could bring that same spirit into the room. And guitar, he always had this kind of spiritual thing to his playing that was really important to me personally, especially at that time, because that whole kind of spiritual thing was starting to die down, and it was kind of a different era because you had all the new guys coming up, the kind of jazz historians, as I call them, whose thing didn't really have the same sort of spiritual fire to it because it was about something else. But for me, Arthur was kind of like one of the last people of that, from that time, who really kind of was holding the flame forward to kind of put something into the music beyond just playing the instrument. Are there,
and now you talk about guys in the neighborhood, are there other names that listeners might be familiar with?
A lot of, I don't think there's going to be a lot of names that people are going to know, because a lot of the guys became sidemen for other people, I mean, that's kind of was the funny thing of that time, that a lot of us, just decided to, how can I put this? I mean, I don't want to say sure money, but there was an opening to do things because everybody was so talented on the instrument. A lot of people needed a lot of people to, help them out with what they were doing. So a lot of the guys from the hood ended up becoming famous sidemen as opposed to taking the next step and kind of doing their own thing, I mean, I guess, guys like me and V, we were just much more oddballs, and when you're an oddball, you kind of got to go your own way, So the guys who had the same level of facility became more kind of pop guys,
Now, speaking of oddballs going their own way, and Soundscape, which we were talking about, there's a number of dates of Arthur playing at Soundscape. Do you have any recollection of him there, and anything come to mind?
No, more just seeing him there. I actually didn't really go to, I was kind of in my own head at that point. I didn't really check him up at Soundscape that much. So I can't really speak particularly on, the particular date there. I mean, I saw him at Rashid's a couple of times, because, we actually were doing the Funky Free Boppers thing, and I was doing that with him. But as far as actually seeing the group up at Soundscape, I think I must have caught a sound check a couple of times, but I hadn't actually been around for the gigs. But what I do remember is like other people kind of talking about him afterwards. It's like, oh man, you hear about this guy, and they'd all be trying to tell me about this new guy,
right?
And I'd be kind of like, yeah, I'm familiar with him. And unfortunately, he passed before he could make his mark on, wider society. But he's definitely remembered by the guys who were touched by him, for sure.
Yeah. People talk about somebody like this seeming to be in this huge hurry.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've heard a lot of artists discussed in those terms. I didn't know Arthur Rhames well, but you really had that sense about him. He was on fire to get this thing done.
Yeah, he was very much about accomplishing stuff, and it's ironic that it's ironic that it turned out that way, because it's almost like a thing. I mean, it's not that there's any connection there, but I think of Tupac immediately. Tupac was one of them guys. It's like he was always in the studio. It's like people, to the point where people think he's not dead because there's still records coming out.
Right.
And Arthur was kind of like that. He was always pushing and doing stuff. And there's a lot, there's not. Fortunately, Verna has a lot of documentation of things, but he was doing a lot of things and going a lot of different ways, like you said. I mean, people didn't know he played. Some people didn't know. The people who knew him as a guitar player didn't know he played sax sometimes. People didn't know that he had covered so many different musical directions, and from rock to jazz, blues. He could do a lot of different things. It's kind of more like one of them guys. He would just put his mind to something and then kind of conquer it, and then that's kind of what he did.
Let's go back to this recording, and we're trying to get you some detailed information about exactly the details of this. It's been listed as October 30th, 1981, although a log that we have of recordings at Soundscape doesn't show that. So see if we can get some more information for you before the next mic break. But would you want to hazard a guess about exactly who we're hearing along with Arthur Rhames?
No, I couldn't tell you at that
Okay.
point, because
All right.
it's kind of like trying to figure out who's who. Simply, part of it is because Arthur played he played sax, piano, and guitar, so it's almost like you don't know when he's jumping on the piano or the other guy's jumping on the piano. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes.
We're sitting here in the studio going, all right, the sax solo ended and a piano solo just started.
Yeah.
Is that Arthur?
Yeah, exactly.
And, he could even, he probably could play with one hand on each and do something like that. He could definitely throw you off.
Exactly. We'll never, we'll have to get one of the guys up here who was actually there. But, it sounds, I couldn't really hazard a guess on, like I said, maybe the drummer is the same drummer that he always had at that point.
Very possible. We'll try to get you some more information about that. But the thing I have to share with the listeners, how exciting this is to me, and I think anybody who had the opportunity. If you saw Arthur Rhames, chances are good that you remember it, and it's a name that would stick in your head, and you'd say, oh, this guy, he's probably going to have a record out next year on some big label, and I got to remember that. That day never came, and for many years there was nothing available, I don't think, at all with Arthur Rhames' name on it. Mm-hmm. And despite his great efforts for a number of years, but here this comes to light. This recording from the archives of Soundscape, and we have a few of them we're going to get to tonight. It really is something very magical to have appeared out of seemingly no place. So should we give him a chance to hear a little more music?
Yeah, let's do that.
Melvin Gibbs is a guest tonight. We are at Soundscape, 52nd Street and 10th Avenue, and we are in the music of Arthur Rhames. I'm Mitch Goldman on WKCR.
going to listen to John Esposito on the piano and Jeff Siegel on the drums. And that's up Arthur Rhames. We're going to do a short finale for you, and that'll be it for tonight.
That, sadly, is the way that it ends.
That's all you get.
Music from Arthur Rhames. You know, there we go. I wasn't hearing myself. That was a little off-putting. But that was music from Arthur Rhames recorded live at Soundscape, October 30th, 1981. You're here in the studio with us, WKCR, my guest, Melvin Gibbs.
Hey.
And we did get to find out, I had to go back to the original source reel-to-reel tapes to find out that that was John Esposito playing piano.
Yeah, I figured that would be it.
Jeff Siegel on drums, and two of Arthur Rhames' frequent cohorts and bandmates. We did, when Arthur died, and I don't remember the exact date, it was right around 20 years ago, if I remember correctly, and both those guys were in the studio talking about playing with Arthur and the royal kicking that they got every night on the bandstand with him, and what it was to try to find it inside themselves to rise to what he was doing.
Yep.
Spiritually, musically, everything they could pour into it.
Yeah, it's definitely like that. I remember we used to have this little place over in Flatbush that had like this jazz jam session, and I used to play in the band there. And there would always be like all the guys from the neighborhood, you know, and a bunch of guys who, you know, a bunch of like professional guys as well as us up-and-coming guys. And then always be like, everything would always be kind of cool, and then Arthur would show up, and then everything would always kind of go like up like 4 levels, you know, because then he would just like, you know, make everybody do their absolute best just by being in the room and stuff.
And he seemed, I don't know, was he like, I don't know if you can talk about what kind of a person he was. Was it Was it coming from a competitive place? Was he?
No, he wasn't. That's the thing about him. It was just like he was just expressing himself. It wasn't like he was trying to, blow anybody else away. That was not even what his thing was about. His thing was about, he had this thing inside him that he wanted to get out to people, and he was just trying to get it out. So you never felt like you were in a contest. I never felt like I was in a contest with him. I mean, I guess as times went on, some of the new, when it got to that point, when the Young Lions era and when everybody was competing with everybody else, then there was a level of competition. But
it might have also been an advantage to you not playing the instrument, one of the many instruments that Arthur Rhames was playing.
Yeah, but I don't know. I guess I'm a different kind of guy. It's kind of like I just try to find my own lane. It's kind of like I don't worry about, there are people who, technically more, adept than me, but there's not really. I just got my thing that I know works. That's who I am, and so I don't really worry the same way. And that's what we got from Arthur. He had this thing that okay, if you just do you, then you're going to be fine, and that's really what. I got from it, and I take with me is that do you thing, but everybody had to do that, and even John and Jeff, I guess they had to do the same. They had to do them, because they definitely couldn't do Arthur. That's for sure. Nobody could,
And they went back and did it night after night, every chance they got from the sound of it talking to them. So they and still, at least as of then, and since then, when I've run into both those guys, John in particular. That time spent playing with Arthur Rhames, however long or short it was, and I don't remember exactly how long that was left an imprint that stayed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people still talk about it. Anybody who actually experienced, him, even to the point where it's interesting because he was still in that kind of homage stage. Did I say that correctly? Homage. I'm ghetto-fying the word here.
Getting all public radio here.
Exactly.
Go on.
Homage. Let's say it correctly. But the point is that even within that process, you could hear that there was something really unique in there. So we didn't really get to see where it would have went once he had kind of like gotten out of the cocoon. But even within the cocoon, you could see that there was just such a great fire there, and everybody was really attracted to that.
Yeah, he is definitely in a bit of in Coltrane shadows, maybe more than a bit. We heard his take on Moment's Notice, but done in his own way with that at that ballad tempo, which is far from what Coltrane ever played that, and making it his own. So he gets... He's finding his way.
Yeah, definitely. I would say. I mean, that's the thing that's interesting about the guitar because it's kind of like he'd already kind of came through on the other side. I guess he felt like he'd already conquered that challenge and went on to the next one and tried to do the same thing on the sax. But even like I said, even within that, you can definitely feel the fire and you can feel the creativity as opposed to the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Is for to try to extend the form as opposed to try to emulate the form. You can hear that. You can hear him already trying to get past what was there.
Well, interestingly, now let me just backtrack for everybody in case you're just joining us. This is WKCR FM New York. My name is Mitch Goldman, and Jazz Alternatives is the program weeknights from 6 to 9 p.m. But we are in the waning moments of a festival we've been enjoying for the last 10 days, celebrating the music made at a venue called Soundscape, which was here in Manhattan at 52nd Street and 10th Avenue. A bright light that flashed through the heavens of the music world in the late 70s and early 80s. Thankfully, much of what happened there was documented, at least the music performances and audio recordings, and they've been donated by the club's owner, Verna Gillis, to WKCR, and we're documenting, restoring, and presenting this music. Thankfully, we've stumbled into one of these bright corners, to borrow a term, music of Arthur Rhames, who was, as we've been saying, somebody who was a one of the bright lights on the scene, and influence on my guest tonight, Melvin Gibbs, and somebody who was horrifically under-recorded, underrepresented by the music business, by radio, by the opportunity to document what he was doing. But here at Soundscape, we found these great recordings. And I hope you got to hear a set of his trio just a moment ago. And we're moving now towards recordings that he made along with Rashid Ali, who you mentioned. Did he seek out Rashid? Or, I mean, it would kind of seem to fit with his...
Yeah, I don't actually remember the story of how they hooked up. If anybody knows, feel free to call.
Yeah,
but I know by the time, I know that Rashid was aware of him because, when I was doing the Funky Free Boppers thing back in those days, she definitely had heard the name and stuff, but I don't know if they'd actually played together at that point. I don't really know the particulars. I don't remember the particulars.
Well,
maybe I will. But the point being is once they did hook up, I mean, Rashid kind of took him under his wing and they played a lot together, yes.
And Rashid is, if you don't know, Rashid Ali is somebody who gets, he's kind of a musician's musician as a player, but also as someone who would lead the way for younger musicians and create opportunities. And Arthur Rhames became one of those people that Rashid Ali brought along musically and opened some doors for him. So we're going to go back to Soundscape.
Yes.
And now we had heard Arthur playing mostly tenor saxophone. I think we heard him sit in piano possibly at one point.
In there.
And but now he's going to be playing guitar.
Yeah.
So this is, listening to this now, I feel like I hear his voice more directly on guitar.
Yeah.
But here you have an opportunity to decide for yourself. So we are going back to Soundscape, back down to, it was definitely Hell's Kitchen then.
Yeah,
maybe it's Clinton now. Maybe.
Yeah, depending on,
But it was definitely Hell's Kitchen then.
Depending on which real estate agent you ask. Yes.
Exactly. So we're going to Soundscape. And the leader was Rashid Ali, but prominently featured is guitarist Arthur Rhames on WKCR. Now, you might not hear a lot of applause in there, but that doesn't mean they're not there. If you're listening closely, you can hear the applause. When you listen to this kind of music, it was probably rather voluminous in the room. And if they're miking closely, they usually don't bother miking the audience. So sometimes there might be a huge response from the audience, and you never know it listening to a recording like this. That was, I know there's people scratching their heads going, wow, woo, wow, woo, whoa, wow, wow. One of the great mysteries of the world, one of the lost masters, one of the ghosts, Arthur Rhames. Arthur Rhames, one of the great musicians whose name is sadly unknown to most. And but he was here and left a sparkling trail of great music. Very little of it got recorded, but thankfully this did at the venue Soundscape, which we are celebrating here on the airways of WKCR-FM New York. And my guest in the studio tonight, Melvin Gibbs.
Yes, I'm still here. My second week in a row up in here. I'm actually glad to be here tonight and hearing some great stuff, man. It was some pretty interesting guitar playing there. I was kind of like, oh, okay. And they kind of they took a left turn at the blues, and they kind of went into this kind of weird kind of modern kind of rock / fusion thing. That was kind of really cool there at the end. I was really feeling that.
Now, people who were listening earlier, well, let me once again say who that was we were listening to. It was a duet between Arthur Rhames, R-H-A-M-E-S, by the way, and there were people who called, and that's for everybody who did not call, R-H-A-M-E-S, Arthur Rhames, that's how you spell the last name, with Rashid Ali.
Yes.
And there might be people who are saying, listening to that style of drumming, going, no, that's not Rashid Ali. They must have gotten that wrong.
No, it's definitely Rashid. He used to have, back in those days, he used to have this band called the Funky Free Rappers. And the bass player in the Funky Free Rappers was this young guy from Brooklyn who was still living with his mama. Let me think of his name.
Yeah, what was his name?
Melvin Gibbs.
That was it. Whatever happened to him?
Who knows?
And so you can say firsthand that hearing Rashid playing some backbeats like that.
Oh, he loved that stuff, man. I mean, it's kind of like, you wouldn't think of it, it's because you never know with the older guys, which ones are actually, especially when they're trying to play something commercial, sometimes you can't really figure out which ones are really into it and which ones are just doing it because they have to get some gigs or whatever.
Would you say, can you tell? Would you say you can tell when you hear it if it's...
Well, there's two kind of sides to it. I mean, there's the sort of condescension vibe and there's the execution vibe. I mean, some guys, you can definitely tell when people are kind of condescending to quote pop music or unquote because it just doesn't come across because just because something seems to be easy to play doesn't mean you can do it, just like there's a whole kind of lifestyle component to doing any kind of music that you have to, even if you don't live the lifestyle, you have to at least understand what the context of it is, And
Rashid also, he was struck me as being eternally youthful. He always seemed like he wanted to hear something new. I mean, you'd see him riding his bike around town.
Yeah. Plus, he was gangster, so the fact that he was gangster made any that's the thread that flows through all of these music. If you're a gangster, then you can kind of find your way into it from the blues, the Howlin' Wolf. It's like, there was always a sort of gangster element, and he definitely had that, so that allowed him to find his way into a whole bunch of stuff.
And nobody was going to say no.
Exactly.
So, any other thoughts, things come to mind hearing this music that really all of us, we are hearing this for the first time. This has been unheard. This has been buried. There's a lost treasure here.
One of the things that's really striking me about this stuff and struck me about some of the other things I heard, and in general, I would say looking at the whole tape collection is the sort of, I mean, for me, being, I guess, 20, 19 at that time, the intergenerational aspect of it strikes me very hard because you think about what else was going on in the scene, and you had the whole no wave scene and the punk scene, and then we were, I guess by 81, people had already started using Linn drums. Then I don't know if they had started. Maybe that was 82. I'd have to look it up.
It was right around there.
Yeah, but just thinking about the fact that so much of this music was created by guys who were considerably old for pop music. And they had this kind of interaction with the guys who were the kids, like me and Drayton and Jamal, and there was a whole intergenerational thing to the music that put another kind of spin on it that it's kind of interesting to listen to for me now, because you can kind of hear you can hear a little more history in the music than you might hear in some of the other things, but you can also hear this kind of melding process, and it's interesting because this is 81, so it's kind of a lot of things are in transition, so that got to another place by 82, 83, even thinking of like, Blood's music or whatever, what he was doing in 81 as opposed to what he was doing in 83. It's really interesting to hear this kind of weird sort of evolutionary moment, because you think of in terms of what was going on in New York as far as the quote no wave scene. I mean, it was essentially 81 was like the height of it. That was it, that was but you're listening to this music and you can still hear that it's going to be there's more to the process. So it's interesting to think about,
Anything you want to tie in thinking about that, of what life was like in New York City, of what economics, politics, anything else that was going on in the music scene, the pop music scene, the
economic politics. I mean, that's a whole nother thing. I mean, like I was saying last week, we have Obama now, so it's kind of like I wouldn't want to go back. But one of the main thing, and you can even, the main thing that has to be said about that time, especially once you hit like 80, 81, is that's really when the culture kind of came out of the ghetto, and when people who weren't living in the ghetto kind of interfaced with it in a different way than they were used to. It's kind of like, oh, there's stuff going on in there, and then even in as far as the Lower East Side and places like that, that's when people first started actually living in the ghetto that didn't actually grow up there. So it's kind of like a weird crossover thing. Of course, the icon now is like Jean-Michel, who wasn't, a ghetto guy per se, but it's that whole idea of stuff coming up out of different areas and contributing to the larger pop world and the larger art world, even that hadn't done so before. And you can hear that even with the music. You can hear that a lot. That's one of the great things. Looking at even the Soundscape personnel, you have the big Latin contingent, and you got a bunch of guys trying to combine a bunch of different things that didn't necessarily go together in a sense. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting. I think that the Soundscape document is a document of the beginning of this kind of cross-fertilization process that kind of didn't really happen, because it was even still at that point. I mean, you still had what you still have today, this kind of weird break between the free jazz scene and the improv scene. And, and it's kind of like, for me as African-American, I always see that, to me, that's kind of like a false dichotomy, because, it's improv, free jazz. What's the difference really at the end of the day? It's just, it's a marketing thing to us. It's not really a musical thing, because everybody's playing on both sides of that fence. But at that time, it was very much more obvious, demarcation was the racial thing, which I'm glad to see, 20 years later, 30 years later at this point, that thing is not valid in the same way, So, but having said that, the thing that's really powerful about the document as a whole is you can see that this process was happening, the cross-pollination and the process of looking at classical music from a jazz standpoint, looking at jazz music from a classical standpoint, looking at funk music from an avant-garde standpoint, looking at avant-garde music from a funk standpoint. All these weird formal combinations that weren't thought of before is really interesting to see.
And here, especially everything you're describing is presented in such naked form in that duet. It's only two guys.
Yeah.
And I got thrown at one point. I was hearing this counterline that Arthur was playing on his lower strings, and I was like, wait a minute, who's that bass player?
Playing bass? Like I was telling you, because Arthur had that thing where he could do like the Stanley Jordan thing. He could sound like he was two or three people, and he was kind of doing. He didn't really do it to the extent that but he had that kind of facility.
Clearly,
and it's funny because you can hear him kind of going through the cliche rock thing. There, it's like a bunch of different, the combination of elements it's really interesting to listen to.
Oh yeah, and it's just Arthur Rhames and Rashid Ali. Rashid, who most people, if they know one thing about him, it's for playing this music with Coltrane in 1965, 66, and here he's in this whole other place with Arthur. Now, do you think this is more Arthur's creation or Rashid's or both? Or that's archetypal Arthur Rhames guitar to my ear.
Sure. That's Arthur. For sure, Arthur was doing his thing, and Rashid was doing it along with him. They were doing their thing together, but it's like a lot of the moves that I heard Arthur do there. I recognize. And it's just really interesting to hear him, do them. It's just hear the influences, but then you can really hear much more in the guitar playing that he had kind of. It's almost more like the influences were more a touchstone for other people in a sense. It's kind of like, okay, I'm going to do something that people know as fusion, or I'm going to do something that people know as rock.
He can dip right into that McLaughlin bag like You know,
Yes.
I mean, not too many people.
Yeah, so I think it was, you know, it's almost kind of postmodern. It's almost like sampling to me when I hear it because, you know, it's kind of like, okay, kind of like the ways that, you know, Charlie Parker would use a corny standard or something just so people had something to hang on to. A lot of times, you know, you hear Arthur do things and you know it's for the listener as opposed to for him as a musician. It's kind of, okay, let me throw this thing out here so people know where I'm going with this. You know?
Arthur is not afraid of the cornball lick. He'll go there.
Yeah, well, you know, it's it's good. The whole thing I always say to people is you have to embrace your corniness, you know, because everybody loves something corny. I mean, you know, what was Coltrane's biggest song was My Favorite Things, right? You know, you know, what was it? They used to play all the guys, jazz guys play like I Ring a Bell, you know. If I Were a Bell, I mean, you got all of these super duper corny songs that these guys just flip because they weren't, you know, even Miles at the End playing, you know, what was it?
Human Nature,
the Cyndi Lauper song.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's the corny stuff. You know, it really gives you this kind of weird kind of juxtaposition thing to work with if you can embrace it enough to get to the other side. You know? But it goes back to what you were saying before. We were talking about before about the guys embracing pop music or funk. If there's a point where you have to embrace it so you can kind of really deconstruct it. If you don't, if you try to keep that distance, then everything kind of gets cornified because you don't really know what side of the fence you're on. If you don't take it all the way, you just end up cornifying everything because you don't know any better. So you kind of have to step into it the other way. And it's the same thing with jazz. You know, it's like if you're going to play jazz, then you actually have to sit down and like play some jazz because then the same thing happens the other way. Then you just end up cornifying all the jazz you do.
Oh, there's nothing more toxic than like playing, you know, actively playing non-jazz.
Yeah.
But we'll save that for another show. We are at Soundscape. Soundscape is the place where all of this unfolded. Melvin Gibbs, you want to, we kind of talked about this last week, but give a little thumbnail sketch of the place, where it was, and the kinds of things that unfolded there.
Well, you know, it's funny because I haven't been on that block in so long, but since everything else in New York City has been gentrified, I'd imagine that block has been too.
It has and it hasn't. The building is very recognizable.
Oh, yeah.
Very recognizably the same. And some of the characters are still definitely been there all the time.
Oh, it's like that. They didn't get to that block yet.
They're working on it.
That's still Hell's Kitchen. We're not in Clinton yet.
No. They're working on it. They're hammering away. There's a really very elegant little cool restaurant across the street, and if you blink your eyes and turn your head, your head might just fall off from the shock of it. But there's you could get a little bit of the vibe. You could still smell a little bit of it.
You can still smell a little bit. Yeah, back as we had said last week, back then
that is one of two sessions that we have recorded of the three altogether that we attempted to make on that night of September 20th, 2010. So glad that we have what we have. And once again, my guest, Melvin Gibbs. Check out Melvin's music. His range of thought and inspiration, aside from his magnificent bass playing, is something to explore and discover and open doors with. That's what this music, that's what this show is all about, and I can't think of anybody who embodies it more than Melvin Gibbs. So find your way to Melvin Gibbs's music, Gibbs. But we're talking about somebody who did not make the journey all the way, but boy, what he did while he was here. Arthur Rhames, and you hear me spell out his name, Rhames. In the second part of the show, and once again, most of these, it's a 3-hour program. We usually have 3 hours of the podcast. I'm now playing back some of these episodes that were not recorded completely or properly. So we've got what we've got, and we're going to hear as much as I can share with you, as much as I have. In the next part of it, part 2, you'll hear Melvin talking about, and we'll hear the music of Lee Rozie, Rozie, another brilliant musician who I'm happy to say is still among us and making music. And so come on back for that. Once again, Monday, September 20th, 2010. My guest, Melvin Gibbs, and the topic of the venue, Soundscape. All right. See you over there.